presentation for Ohio Archaeology Month. My name is Lynn Newell, and I'm in charge of special projects here at the Athens County Historical Society and Museum, and we welcome you. Archaeology Month is an important event in any state, and many states celebrate Archaeology Month, and they get to choose which month they do that in. And in Ohio, it's in October. And here at the Athens County Historical Society and Museum, we have a tradition, this is our second year, so it's a tradition, of having speakers that come, we hope, right after work for people to be able to come and hear. And they talk about all aspects of archaeology that are relevant to this area of Ohio. And we've had a wonderful set of speakers this year, so if you're interested in archaeology, make sure that you're a member, and we'll send you information about next year's Archaeology Month, because we'd love to see you here again next year. We are very, very honored tonight to have Brad Lepper talking with us. Brad is the Curator of Archaeology for the Ohio History Connection. You may know of it as the Ohio Historical Society, but they've changed their name recently. It's the Ohio History Connection. And Brad is the major archaeologist there. And he has a variety of interests, and one of them is the Newark Earthworks, and he's going to be telling us important information about the earthworks. How many of you have been there and have seen the earthworks in person? Oh, good. That's important, because he's going to be telling us a little bit about the future of the earthworks and what kind of things are going to be happening there. So we are very pleased and very honored to be able to say that we have Dr. Brad Lepper here for us this evening. Brad?
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for that wonderful greeting from you all. Pleased to be here tonight to share with you some of what I've learned about the Newark Earthworks. The Newark Earthworks are a spectacular site. It's a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest designation the United States can give to an archaeological or historic site. And as I'll talk about at the end, it's going to be part of a nomination to become a World Heritage Site. And if you have any questions as to whether or not it should be a World Heritage Site or not, I hope by the end of my presentation, it won't be an issue. You'll fully appreciate what an extraordinary site it is. Not just was before the city of Newark got built over the top of it, but is indeed today. As it was originally existed, and this is a computerized reconstruction based on the best data we have. I worked really closely with the Center for the Electronic Reconstruction of Historic and Archaeological Sites on this. It's based on the best available mapping, the best available data. It's our best guess of what the site would have looked like from the air 2,000 years ago. It was the largest complex of geometric earthworks, not just in the Hopewell world, but in the entire world. It covered more than 4.5 square miles. It involved, by a conservative estimate, 7 million cubic feet of earth. It was built with a technology that, and as an anthropologist, I don't use this word lightly, a primitive technology. Simple is probably a better word. Pointed sticks, clamshell hose, and baskets. People would dig up the earth, fill up a basket, and carry it on their backs, one at a time. More than 7 million cubic feet of earth to construct this. So I'm admitting the technology is simple, but as I'm going to attempt to show you, the knowledge that is encoded in this earthwork is anything but primitive. It's remarkable. So, make this go forward. This is the map I'll be using. It's not necessarily the map that provided the basis for that previous reconstruction, but this is probably the most famous map of the Newark Earthworks. If you've only seen one map, this is the one you've seen. It's very iconic. It was published in the Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, which was the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution, which speaks to the importance of this map and the other maps in that volume, not just for the history of American archaeology, but for the history of American science. I'll be using this because it's such a beautiful map and because it's pretty simple as the sort of the base map for what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So this, in general, is what it would have looked like at around 1840 if you were hovering above it in a hot air balloon. There's some major mistakes, but it shows that already the site is being impacted by European Americans. This is the Ohio Canal. It blew off a corner of the square. It went through a burial mound. Later, the Central Ohio Railroad cuts through here, destroying more burial mounds. In fact, they used some of the burial mounds here for fill to make the railroad embankment. But between the canal and the railroad, Newark, which was founded over here, became an important transportation center, grew rapidly, eventually encompassing much of this site. Squire and Davis, when they were writing about the Newark Earthworks in 1848, said, "The ancient lines can now be traced only at intervals among gardens and outhouses." And they predicted that 50 years down the road, the people of Newark would have to look at this map to even know that this complex had once existed here. Now, I won't say unique to Newark, but extraordinarily for Newark, that prediction did not prove true. The people of Newark adopted some pretty interesting ways to preserve elements of that, to incorporate some of these earthworks into their own landscape. And because of that, we have the best preserved geometric earthworks of the Hopewell world in Newark. And so because of these two things, the extraordinary achievement of the ancient American Indians that constructed it, and the extraordinary work of early European Americans to preserve elements of that, some local Newark school kids a few years back got this site listed as Ohio's official prehistoric monument. So that's what it looks like in 1848. Oh, I want to tell you something about the scale of this site, and then I'll come back to what it looks like today. It's going to be a World Heritage Site. I don't think there's any question about that. It's just a question of when. So let's compare the scale of other World Heritage Sites that you might be more familiar with. The Great Pyramid of Egypt, the largest pyramid of Egypt, would fit comfortably inside the square. Roman Colosseum, 4 of those would fit just inside the octagon. That's a 50-acre octagon. And Stonehenge, maybe the world's most iconic prehistoric monument, would fit inside that small circle, which is only small because it's next to this gigantic octagon. The Hopewell culture are the people that constructed the Newark Earthworks, so it's probably worthwhile not assuming everybody knows about the Hopewell culture. Let me give a brief introduction. They lived here in central Ohio in particular, but there were things going on all over eastern North America that were related to it. But between about 100 BC and AD 400, and I think as our chronology gets increasingly refined, I think that's going to shrink. I think it's going to be more like 1 AD to AD 300. I think this Hopewell explosion, as one prominent Hopewell archaeologist referred to it as, this extraordinary fluorescence, this eruption of art, architecture, and ritual, I'm not sure it would actually be sustainable for that long. So I think it really was an explosion that some archaeologists don't like it when you refer to it as a collapse. But I think this ritual explosion really did have a peak, and then it rapidly dropped off. And it's not that the civilization collapsed, the civilization changed in important ways, which I haven't planned to talk about, but we can talk about that in the questions and answers if you like. But really, this period was a unique period that witnessed this profusion of monumental architecture, some extraordinary art, that one component of it is that it was crafted from raw materials that were brought from the ends of their world, literally. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, the copper from the upper Great Lakes, mica from the Carolinas, and this gigantic obsidian biface, a spear point effigy, I suppose, because it couldn't have possibly been used as a spear point. I mean, that literally is that big. It's as big as a dinner plate. And it's made out of obsidian, a black volcanic glass, and every obsidian has its own chemical fingerprint. And when this was first excavated, everybody thought Mexico. This is going to show that the mounds are connected to Mexico. But in fact, it comes from obsidian cliffs in Yellowstone Park. At least the vast majority of Hopewell obsidian comes from that source. So in spite of the fact that these people didn't live in big cities, it wasn't an urban civilization, there was no sophisticated hierarchy of leadership, of kings, nobles, commoners, slaves, nothing like that. How they were able to sustain monumental architecture on that scale and this broad, we call it an interaction sphere because we don't like to draw undue conclusions. I have my own ideas about what the interaction sphere represents, and trade is only part of it. Most people assume it's a trading network. Trade's definitely a part of it, but it's not the only story. So yeah, the people did not live at these earthwork centers. They lived in small little villages, and archaeologists don't even like to call them villages because they were so small. We call them hamlets. You could almost refer to them as homesteads where extended families would live, and they would garden, but they weren't agriculturalists in the same way that the Mississippian people, the Fort Ancient culture, would become. When you study the chemistry of their bones, they're hunters and gatherers primarily, and fishers. But they have this ability, they've domesticated these plants called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And it's not corn. Corn comes in late in Hopewell. It's not an important part of the diet. But they're growing things like sunflower and squash and chenopodium, small little oily and starchy seeds that provide a storable surplus. And I think these are the foods that probably allowed periodic concentrations of large numbers of people at the great ceremonial centers, but it also evened out the food supply for the winter. Hunter-gatherers had great diets, broad spectrum diets, and healthy diets, but they would often, in northern latitudes like Ohio, have difficulty getting enough to eat during the winter. Agriculturalists, like the Mississippian folk, ate lots of corn, and it wasn't a very balanced diet. Very few of them got enough meat. Stature declines, they get all kinds of health problems. Well, the Hopewell had the best of both those worlds, a primarily hunting-gathering diet, but they had the supplementary foods provided by the Eastern Agricultural Complex. So they lived in little small communities surrounding these earthworks, but periodically hundreds or maybe more of these little communities would gather to build and engage in ceremonial activities at these places. And the Newark Earthworks is not a local community church. It's a cathedral built to serve an enormous area. At least that's what the scale of the site tells me. So here's that pan-continental interaction sphere. When I was first hired by the Ohio History Connection, it was to be the curator of the Newark Earthworks in the Flint Ridge State Memorials. And Flint Ridge, that museum at the time had a big map on it that showed all the places around eastern North America where Flint Ridge flint had been found at archaeological sites. And it was almost a perfect reflection of this. And the story was that Flint Ridge flint is what people in Newark traded to get this other stuff. But when you look at the actual quantities of material involved, which I did because I took that map and it's like, okay, Pinson Mounds. There's Flint Ridge flint at Pinson Mounds in Tennessee. How much Flint Ridge flint did they find there? Well, there's like about a dozen bladelets, which are like replaceable razor blades. You could literally hold all of them in the palm of your hand. Mica comes from eastern Tennessee in the Carolinas. One of the small mounds at Newark, the one the Ohio Canal dug through, there's actually a footnote in the Squire and Davis book that says 20 bushels of mica came out of that mound. So unless this is some bad fairy tale, I'll trade you these, dozen magic bladelets for those 20 bushels of mica, I don't think we're talking about trade at all. I think, well, I'm sort of jumping ahead to my conclusions, but I think this is Mecca. I mean, this is Jerusalem. This is a pilgrimage center. And people are coming, bringing offerings of stuff, and taking away, well, the magical experience of having been at this place and engaged in the ceremonies, perhaps even helping to build them, leaving the offerings and taking away a pilgrim's token. If you look at pilgrimage cross-culturally, there's almost always, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Taoist, Buddhist, Muslim, there's almost always that I'm taking away a badge, a token evidence that I've made the Great Hajj. And perhaps those bladelets of Flint Ridge flint would have been kept and used, you bring that up to cut your daughter's wedding cake or something on ritual occasions, and then the fact that you're cutting that cake with a Flint Ridge bladelet adds great weight and authority to the fact, oh, he's somebody to be reckoned with. So that's my notion of what's going on here. There's trade, certainly, but the quantity of material is so much greater in Hopewell than it is even in the early woodland, the Adena culture and the related cultures, that something new is happening. Okay, now we're back to this base map. The Newark Earthworks, circa 1848. I've given you the outline. There are these major earthwork components: octagon earthworks, the great circle, the square, and the cemetery. This used to be an oval earthwork, not a horseshoe-shaped earthwork. That's what it looks like today. So let me back up. Before, after. This island of green down here is the great circle. And the island of green up here, that looks kind of like a golf course, doesn't it? Well, it's because it is a golf course. That's the circle and the octagon. I'll come back to that part of the story later. So these two major elements are preserved. The burial mounds, well, that became an area of heavy industry, warehouses, the railroad, the rolling mill, all kinds of things were there. It was probably the first major component of the Newark Earthworks to disappear. And the square came shortly after that. Newark came spreading across in that sort of fashion. But the great circle was preserved, and I'll tell you why later, and the circle and octagon was preserved. Now, using that same base map, let me talk about the extraordinarily sophisticated knowledge that's incorporated, that's embedded in this earthwork. And the Hopewell, of course, left us no written language. We have no book of their geometrical knowledge. And so for a long time, people assumed they just built these circles and squares, but they didn't know any geometry, really. Well, let's wait and see. The diameter of the great circle is equal to the circumference. I guess I said that wrong. No, the circumference of the circle is equal to the perimeter of the square. Now, I understand that's a relatively simple geometrical conundrum called rectifying the circumference. It's pretty easy to do, but it does suggest that when this was built, there was an intentional geometrical relationship between these places that was established by that geometrical connection. Squaring the circle, the area of that square is equal to the area of that circle. When my sons studied geometry, they told me squaring the circle was a geometrical conundrum that was impossible because pi was an irrational number or something like that. Anyway, so technically it's impossible, but the Hopewell, I think, we're playing with the idea. We're coming very close to doing it. I mean, this is a very close approximation to a square and a circle having the same area. And we're still not done. The area of the great circle, which is slightly larger than this circle, is equal to the area of a square that you could construct in the octagon by drawing lines from alternate vertices of the octagon. It's a perfect square. The sides of the square are equal to the diameter of the circle, which is 1,054 feet. But the area of that square is equal to the area of that circle. So this is kind of a cryptic feature. It's not a square that you can actually see when you're there, but it's part of the geometry. And it suggests geometrical connections with all of these different parts of the site. And I feel that those geometrical connections and the fact that all of these components don't duplicate each other, the fact that this is the cemetery, that this great circle had an interior ditch that was probably filled with water, and none of the other earthworks has an interior ditch. So I think it's got a special function. The circle and octagon, well, I'll talk more about what is a special component of that site. I view this as a ceremonial machine conceived by some one person or group of people, although I have a hard time with a committee designing something like this. And I think that individual oversaw its construction. Because if that's not true, then these people who did not have a political hierarchy somehow sustained a vision generated by one man or woman over generations. There are Hopewell earthworks that were built over generations. Fort Ancient is an excellent example of that. Radiocarbon dating has demonstrated it. I think this is an example of the opposite, of an earthwork that was conceived and built in a relatively short period of time, an intense period of activity that realized a synthesis of all that the Hopewell had been developing in architecture in the Scioto Valley for probably generations before. And I think people came north in significant ways and built this as a demonstration of all the knowledge that they had learned up till then. The distance from the center of this circle to the center of this circle is exactly 6 times the diameter of that circle. So I think there's a common unit of measure that's being used here. The distance from the center of the octagon to the center of the square is that same measurement, 6 times that diameter. Now this I'm not so sure about, but the late Jim Marshall, a civil engineer who did maps of all the earthworks in Ohio and many other states, pointed out that if you drew a line from the center of the octagon to the center of the great circle, and then drew an east-west line and a north-south line, that you'd construct a 3-4-5 right triangle. And he said it meant, because he found this relationship at other Hopewell sites, that these people understood the Pythagorean theorem. I don't know that that's true. And I think when I originally read Jim Marshall's article, which was back in the late 70s or something, I didn't believe it. But why not? Pythagoras came up with that idea long before the Hopewell, a couple centuries probably. Why couldn't these people do it? To say they couldn't because they were naked savages, that they were illiterate or something, is more than ethnocentric, it's racist. So it seems surprising, but when you think about everything else these people accomplished, maybe it's not such a stretch. So let me take you on a tour of the sites now. Photograph of the Great Circle with its interior ditch. This is just inside the gateway. You're walking in the gateway, looking off to the left. This is another view from the Surhaus reconstruction, highlighting the interior ditch. Now that's a unique feature of the Great Circle. It's more common with Adena culture circles, and there are some people who say that means this was an earlier construction. This was like the original construction, and then the rest of the earthworks were built on later, perhaps generations, maybe centuries later. That's possible. But it's also possible that Hopewell people built this referencing the earlier architecture of the Adena. It's like if your bank has Greek columns on it. It doesn't mean it was built 2,000 years ago. It was built in modern days by architects who were evoking Greek architecture for particular reasons. I think that might be what's going on here. Now, why does it have a ditch? I think there's pretty good evidence that it held water. There are some Native American beliefs that the spirits of the dead can't cross bodies of water. So this may have been a place where human deceased persons were being processed for burial, and it was necessary for the duration of those ceremonies that the spirits be contained in that area. That's just speculation, although it does involve actual American Indian beliefs. Well, this is a great old illustration showing this Fort Apache or something at the Great Circle. It's been called the Old Fort for years. I still find the occasional person from Newark that will refer to it as the Old Fort because it's got the high wall and it's got the ditch or moat, if it held water. Of course, if it was a moat, what's wrong with the picture? It's on the wrong side of the walls, of course. Well, Cornelius Matthews in 1839 recognized that if it was a fort, having the ditch inside the walls was an issue, but he said it was constructed on principles of military science, now lost or inexplicable. There's a guy that's committed to an interpretation, regardless of the facts. The Great Circle was saved because it became the Licking County Fairgrounds. And in fact, in 1854, the Ohio State Fair was held there. There was a racetrack that ran around inside it. There was, at one point, a switchback railroad, which we now call a roller coaster. There was a Ferris wheel, I think like the third one in the United States was at this park. Shooting galleries, all kinds of barns for different animals to show. But even though it was a fairgrounds and people were going there today for the same reason people go to Kings Island or Cedar Point, all the sort of literature about it, the Great Circle was one of the main attractions. The fact that it wasn't just simply plopped there because it was a convenient circle, it was there to partake of the mystery and the attraction that that site held for people. The fact that we wouldn't put a fairgrounds there today, I don't think says that what they were doing was awful and was desecrating the circle. They were finding, I think, a very creative way to preserve the site. In 1992, myself and Dr. Deanne Weimer from Bloomsburg University excavated a trench through the Great Circle, wanting to understand how it was built, whether it was built in stages or whether it was built all at once. We found a bunch of remarkable things we hadn't anticipated. One thing we didn't find was any charcoal to date. We did find, when we got to the bottom of this, something that's highly unusual in Hopewell Earthworks that also might suggest it's made in a different time, but I don't believe it. In almost all cases, the Hopewell stripped off the A-horizon, the topsoil, and they built their earthworks on the firm foundation established by the subsoil. Here they built the earthwork right on top of the ground surface. So as we uncovered it, we were uncovering the ground surface that the Hopewell people themselves walked on. But that did a couple things. A soil scientist from Denison University looked at that soil profile and said, that looks like a prairie soil profile to me. And we took samples from that and had pollen and phytoliths looked at, and it confirmed that it was indeed a prairie at the time the earthworks were built. Well, ecologically, it shouldn't have been a prairie. It should have been an oak hickory forest. In fact, I had a bet with Deanne Weimer. Deanne Weimer's a paleoethnobotanist, and we were co-directing it, and she was convinced it was going to be an oak hickory forest. And I said, I think it's going to be a prairie, and I had a couple of historical reasons for thinking that, but also because of the complex design of the earthworks. If there had been a full oak hickory forest there, it means people with stone axes would have cleared 4.5 square miles of land and then drag the trees off to be able to lay out this precise survey of the Newark Earthworks. It's like, it's probably a prairie. That would have made it much easier. Well, this confirms that it was indeed a prairie surrounded by this ocean of oak hickory forest. So it was an island, and it hadn't just been burned off. So I think it had been a prairie for hundreds, if not thousands of years preceding this. And the reason for that, hunting and gathering peoples all over the world burn off chunks of forest to create openings because a closed forest has very few deer or other game in it, but a forest with lots of openings has lots of deer. So I think this landscape was being managed for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years before the Hopewell were ever there. They took advantage of this opportunity of finding this confluence of rivers and this broad open prairie was the perfect tapestry for them to build the Newark Earthworks on. On top of that, our trench happened to bisect a low mound made out of pretty uniform grayish clay. And what we extrapolate, we only did one trench, we extrapolate that they picked the center point, and they didn't do that haphazardly. They did that according to a complicated survey. They knew exactly where they wanted to make the center point. And then they put some kind of a rope, maybe 600 feet long, because it's a 1,200 foot diameter circle, and then began to walk around in a circle and at various points building little mounds. So we think at the beginning of stage 1, it would have been a circle, these low mounds that would define where the circle would be built. In stage 2, they dig the trench, leave a gap, and then take the dark brown earth from the upper layers of the soil and pile it on top of that mound. So here in this profile, you can see the mound, and then this dark brown earth. And here you can see how dark brown it is. These are actually samples of that soil. And then the outer embankment, they took the subsoil and filled in from the top of that dark brown earthwork to the edge of the ditch. So that when the earthwork was freshly constructed, it would look mostly dark brown from the outside, bright yellow brown on the inside. Now this is reconstruction added when the fairgrounds became a park. There was a lot of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, did minor restorations at the site. We picked this location because there were no trees there. And we began digging, and over here we hit, when we got to this level, cement steps that had been over. Where did the cement steps come from? They had jackhammered a bunch of the cement steps and used some of that broken cement to help in these reconstructions. But that's why there were no trees growing there, is because there was a cement platform underneath it. So we had to move our trench this way to go down all the way. But all of this is restoration, and we actually have the blueprints from the CCC showing that in most cases the circle was not restored, only in places where it had been damaged by fairground activities, and this is one. So what that might have looked like, what that profile might have looked like if it had gone up, we're not quite sure. But this contrast of light brown stuff on the inside and dark brown has actually been found at Hopewell to be the same light on the inside, dark on the outside pattern. At the center of the Great Circle, almost, well, unique to the Newark complex, is what's been called Eagle Mound. And who thinks that looks like an eagle? Or a bird of any kind? It's an ink blot test, I think. Is it a bird's footprint? Is it an arrow pointing that way? Somebody thought it looked like a person floating in the water. Just okay. It has this shape because what was there first had sort of a similar shape. This is the excavation map done by Emerson Greenman in 1928 when he excavated it. And it appears to be a longhouse in the center. And it's not a place where people lived. There were no garbage pits or cooking fires. There was, at the very center, a bathtub-shaped clay basin that had repeated burning episodes in it. Similar features in Chillicothe mounds have been cremation facilities, but there were no human remains here. It had been cleaned out and filled with white sand as part of its decommissioning. And then the structure disassembled and this mound built on top of it. And Greenman in his notes reported that there were scraps of mica in the back of the structure and 2 copper artifacts on the floor of the front structure. So there's a seeming difference in the rituals that were taking place back here versus up here. And then there just seemed to be walls going off as if they were screens of some kind, perhaps for the performances that went in there. Now, I didn't mention when the fairgrounds were there, and this isn't just an amusing historical anecdote, there's actually a reason for talking about this. While the fairgrounds were there, of course the Civil War erupted in part of that, and the 76th Ohio Volunteer Infantry used this as their training ground. After the war, in 1880-something, there was a grand reunion of the Union Army held here. And opposite this racetrack, there was a big pavilion erected, a grandstand, that's what the word I'm looking for watching the races. And opposite that, in the center, Newark had built a speaker's platform for President Rutherford B. Hayes, General Sherman, and Garfield, soon to be President Garfield, and some other notables. Ex-President Grant couldn't make it. He was in Milan, Italy, but he sent a telegram to be read to the audience there. And the speaker's platform must have been built, as today, by the lowest bidding contractor, because partway through the program, the speaker's platform began to collapse. A Cincinnati newspaper said that President Hayes and General Sherman and Garfield only saved themselves by throwing themselves forward out of their chairs, the chairs falling backward into the collapsing beam of the speaker's platform. And somebody has told me that Sherman said that one drunken carpenter in Newark almost accomplished what 1,000 rebel sharpshooters were not able to do. But now the teachable moment that comes out of that same Cincinnati newspaper article said 20 to 30,000 people had gathered inside the Great Circle to hear those orations. I don't know that 20 or 30,000 Hopewell people ever gathered in that Great Circle to hear some prayer or oration of Hopewell people, but that's the scale of the architecture. That's how many people you could put in there to engage in some kind of ceremonial activity, which I find remarkable and instructive. The octagon earthworks, a 50-acre octagon, a circle that's only slightly smaller than the Great Circle, but much closer to a perfect circle. It was preserved. The Great Circle had been preserved by the fairgrounds. The northern third of the site was being plowed down, I think of the potato fields or something, and the community wanted to try to save this too. So they said, how can we save it? There were all kinds of newspaper articles where they're trying to find a solution. There is no National Park Service at this time. And someone finally gets the idea that let's put a tax levy out there to raise money to buy it, and then we'll give it to the state, and they can use it as a campground for the National Guard. And the economic carrot there is that every summer, the National Guard comes here and spends money in the local communities. Well, it passed, that tax levy passed by more than 90% in Newark and more than 80% in the surrounding communities. And personally, I don't know of another community that agreed to tax itself to preserve a site. And make no mistake, in spite of the economic gain they had there, they could have done that anywhere. They were doing it here intentionally to try to find a way to preserve the site. And it succeeded. They bought the site. They gave it to the state. The state did, in fact, use it as Camp McKinley for a very short period of time, less than 20 years. And then the National Guard were cramped because the community was growing around them. They couldn't fire off their cannons. They move up to Camp Perry on Lake Erie. And then Newark is stuck with, well, what do we do with it now? And that's when Mound Builders Country Club stepped forward and said, well, we'll make it a golf course, but keep it open to the public, preserve it, maintain it at no cost to the community. They began leasing it from the Newark Board of Trade in 1910. Around 1930, the Newark Board of Trade went defunct in the Great Depression, and when the local courts were dispersing the assets, the Ohio History Connection already had the Great Circle, so they gave the circle and octagon to us. They deeded it over to us. We've owned it, we've been owning it and managing it ever since, and have maintained the relationship with the country club as a community partnership. This is an illustration from Squire and Davis's discussion of the Newark Earthworks, and they describe, just let me back up one. There's a feature here on the opposite side of the circle from the octagon. I know circles don't have sides, but you get my meaning, over there. And they call it the observatory, because if you get up on it, you get a nice observation view of the earthworks. As it turns out, it's a very appropriate name. Two guys from Earlham College in Indiana, Ray Hively, a physicist and astronomer, and Bob Horn, a philosopher, determined that if you stand on the observatory, sight through the connecting walls that connect the circle with the octagon and the far gateway, the point at which you're looking is where the moon rises at its northernmost point on the horizon. If you stand in that gateway and sight right along that wall, you're looking where the moon rises at its southernmost point. And that all happens in 1 month at one end of an 18.6 year-long cycle. 9 years through that, the moon is rising in its monthly cycle at a northern minimum and a southern minimum point. And it took me years to figure out how that worked. And I can explain it maybe later if there are questions. But all you really need to know is that there are 4 points on the eastern horizon and 4 corresponding points on the western horizon that define this cycle, and alignments to all 8 of those are built into this circle and octagon. Here's, in fact, in 2006, the moon rising in direct alignment. So the last time this happened, And for a couple of months on either side of that, it rises so close to it that you can still experience it. I can't tell you how amazing it is to be a student of the Hopewell culture, to stand in the Newark Circle and Octagon, which has been preserved, and to watch the moon rise along its axis, just as those people did 2,000 years ago. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It's a cosmic alarm clock that was set, wound up 2,000 years ago, and it still works. You can go there and experience something of what the people that built it experienced. And that's extraordinary. I mean, it must be what the English archaeologists at Stonehenge experience when they go and watch the summer solstice sunrise or whatever. And there's a time-lapse photograph showing the arc of the moon as it rises. So here's Bob and Ray and all those different alignments and how they're built into the architecture. The northernmost rise, the southernmost rise, the northern minimum rise, the southern minimum rise, and of course the sets. And the Hopewell people built one other circle and octagon. It's 60 miles away in Chillicothe, High Bank Works. The circle is identical in size, 1,054 feet in diameter, and it's nearly a perfect circle. The axis orientation does not point at the northernmost rise of the moon. It points at exactly 90 degrees to this, and doesn't point at any particular astronomical phenomenon. But all 8 of the moon rise and sets are built into that circle and octagon too. I think in that one, well, I know in fact the northernmost rise of the moon corresponds to the axis of the octagon. But the octagon is a lot smaller. But Hively and Horn say because of the difference in latitude, if you took the Newark circle and octagon and put it in Chillicothe, it wouldn't work. So one of the sizes, whichever one was built first, when they moved it either north or to the south, they had to adjust the scale, the design, to accommodate the change in latitude. And I already mentioned to you that the distance between the center of those circles is exactly 6 times that, but that alignment also aligns with the maximum southern rise, and this, also 6 times the diameter of that circle, lines up to the minimum southern rise. So that astronomy isn't just limited to this site, it actually ties the elements of the site together, which goes back into my argument that this couldn't be slapped together over generations or centuries. This was built to a design, and either multiple generations committed themselves to completing it, which I doubt because there would have been no social mechanisms to do that in the Hopewell culture, or, and even though this seems like a ludicrous, outrageous hypothesis, if the others aren't true, this one must be, that it was designed and built within the lifetime of the person who designed it, or persons. Now this is just crazy. A physicist, retired physicist, wrote me and said, you know, the difference in diameter between the observatory circle and the great circle is proportionally the same as the difference in the diameter of the moon at apogee and perigee. You know, the supermoon, that's the diameter of the great circle. And then when the moon is the farthest away, it appears to have the diameter of this circle. Now, is that a coincidence? Maybe. But can we say, no, they couldn't have done that? No, we can't say that. We shouldn't say that. We should be open to the possibility that this is another layer of complexity built into that site. Vine Deloria, a Native American activist, he's written a lot of things that I don't agree with, but in this essay he was talking about Native American architecture. I think he's Lakota, was Lakota, he's passed away. He says, whenever possible, the larger cosmos was represented and reproduced to provide a context in which ceremonies could occur. Thus, people did not feel alone. They participated in cosmic rhythms. I felt a little of that when I stood in the octagon and watched the moon rise along that axis. I can just imagine how 1,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 people standing in there with drums and rattles would have felt when that moon popped up over the horizon in perfect alignment with the axis of that site. And I don't for a minute think these were built as astronomical observatories. I think aligning the architecture with those alignments just made that architecture more sacred. It was like designing a gear that would just fit into the celestial gears of the heavens to make it part of those rhythms and to make the experience of being there more sacred. So it's not an astronomical observatory, it's a aligned to the cosmos ceremonial machine. Now this gets back, trying to find Native American oral traditions that can inform us about the earthworks is a frustrating and probably fruitless endeavor. I've just recently published an article in the Journal of Ohio Archaeology where I've looked for years and really can't find anything that makes sense. Most times when early Europeans from the earliest on up asked local Native Americans questions about the mounds, the Native Americans would say, we don't know, they were here when we got here. But the Creeks in the southeast have a tradition. Creek oral history repeatedly mentions that the Creeks traditionally went north to special mounds for pilgrimages in spring and autumn. Doesn't say how far north, doesn't say they went all the way to Newark, but that Hopewell interaction sphere certainly encompassed the southeastern United States. So could this be a reference to what I've talked about, this being Mecca, Jerusalem? Maybe, but it's so vague, it's not conclusive at all. This is some DNA research that Lisa Mills, an Ohio State University graduate student, did, and I created this map based on her data. She got DNA from the teeth of several people from the Hopewell Mound group in Chillicothe, and then looked at databases of contemporary Native American DNA. And these are all the connections she found, specific bits of DNA that matched up. And we were all hoping when she took those samples that it would show us, oh, the Hopewell are most closely related to the Shawnee, or to the Miami, or the Ojibwa, or somebody. And then when we saw this, first of all, I threw up my hands like, oh, this doesn't make sense at all. I mean, this doesn't tell us anything. Well, maybe it does. I mean, on the one hand, after 2,000 years, this could just be the result of intermarriage between villages over time, and it might lead to a pattern like that. But the fact that it pretty much duplicates in some detail the Hopewell interaction sphere suggests to me that these aren't just commodities moving along a trade network, that these are people. People coming to Newark, to Chillicothe, participating in rituals, leaving offerings, maybe going home with a husband or wife. Or maybe it's deciding to stay here and raise your family and be a part of what's happening in this area. And that maybe that explains this particular distribution of DNA. Well, it concludes mostly what I want to say about Newark, but I want to conclude sort of more broadly about how Newark fits in to the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks nomination, which is already on the United States tentative list. That's the short list that the United States develops of sites from which they will pick to nominate to UNESCO for World Heritage inscription. This is a list of them, you can't read them. Poverty Point was plucked off that list and it just became a World Heritage site, justifiably so. So we think we may not be next, but we're hoping we're pretty high on the list. We've been working very closely with folks from UNESCO and folks from ICOMOS. And I can't remember what ICOMOS stands for, but they're the Scientific Advisory Board for UNESCO. ICOMOS sends the people out to evaluate your site to see whether or not it's going to be a World Heritage Site or not. I think we knocked their socks off when we took them on a tour of the Hopewell sites, especially Newark and Bias. They identified issues, such as the fact that there's a golf course on the Octagon Earthworks. At Hopewell Mound Group, there's a giant army of electrical poles marching across at those giant towers. They weren't too thrilled about that. But we think we can work through these issues and move forward and have these sites recognized as World Heritage Sites. These are the sites that together encompass the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. And the other neat thing about this map is it shows you, this is like the Hopewell heartland, and then, gee, look at Newark up here. It's so separated, it's strange. But it's the Newark Earthworks, it's Fort Ancient, and then the 5 sites that together make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. which of course are Mound City, the Hopewell Mound Group, Hopeton Earthworks, High Bank Works, and Sype Earthworks. So we're going to get both the Newark Circle and Octagon and High Bank Works in this nomination. But that separation I think is interesting because when I first started working at the Newark Earthworks, nobody was talking about Newark. I mean, it was recognized and it was used as illustrations of this weird elephant up north. But this was the Hopewell core. This was the Hopewell heartland. This is where the action is. And I think the reason for that is this. Well, I think there's multiple reasons. One reason is the burial mounds, which down here have given us so much of what we think of as the Hopewell culture. Those at Newark weren't excavated by archaeologists. They were excavated by employees of the railroad and the canal. And there are really no artifacts, with one exception, preserved from those sites. Wish I'd brought the picture of what's called the Ray figurine. I don't much like that name. I call it the Shaman of Newark. If you've never seen it, look it up. It's a stone sculpture of a person, can't tell if it's a man or a woman, wearing bare regalia, bare head on their head, bare claws on their hands, and a human head in his lap. Now, I bring this up because with all that you've learned about Newark now, it's really interesting that this is like the defining artifact of Newark. I was involved in consultation with a Native American woman. She was Quapaw. And she was there representing the Shawnee tribes, and we were doing NAGPRA consultation. That's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And as part of that, she was talking about the last museum she visited and was showing me some images on her computer of buffalo robes that were going to be repatriated to the Quapaw. And one of them is a big buffalo robe with the sun and the moon and other things painted on it. And she pointed to the moon, which had a figure on it that I couldn't quite clear, and she showed me a close-up. And she said, in Quapaw tradition, the moon is a man holding a human head. I went, I have something to show you. So I show her this sculpture, or at least a cast of it. The original is, of course, on display. And the idea that that might not be a Hopewell shaman, but that it might actually be a representation of the moon, I find fascinating. And it has the equivalent, or it has the equal excitement of being a hypothesis drawn from one of the people who has some relationship to what was going on here 2,000 years ago. How to test a hypothesis like that, I have no idea, but it's kind of a neat thought. So these are the sites that comprise the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. We're moving forward with the nomination process, in spite of the fact that we haven't been given the nod to go forward yet. I'm working with the archaeologist Brett Ruby at Hopewell Culture National Historical Park to write some of the basic content, the comparative analysis that demonstrates why these sites are different from any other site in the world, including Cahokia Mounds and Poverty Point, which are already on the World Heritage List. And I think you can see now why it's like unique. We're also doing fundraising because we've talked to other groups that have successfully gone through this process and how expensive it is to do the consultations, to produce this document, which is kind of like a book that's your nomination document. So we're involved in that. We're also involved in lobbying because, gee, imagine this, it's a political process too. So you've got to get all the local governments, the state government aligned and thinking that this is a good thing to do. And of course there we have to talk about what a huge impact it will have on the economy to have World Heritage sites in the state. And in fact, if you include the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, Serpent Mound, which is separately on the tentative list, and a group of sites, Dayton Aviation sites that relate to the Wright brothers, if all those go forward, Ohio will have far more World Heritage sites than any other state in the Union. So this will be a tourist mecca. And once again, pilgrims will be coming from all over to see these amazing sites. And won't that be kind of an interesting coming full circle to what I think these sites were used for 2,000 years ago? Well, that's the end of my formal presentation. I'd be happy to entertain questions. Oh, let me go one more time to that. Yes, sir.
Being a prairie, do you think that they left the grasses in a natural state, and also the mounds themselves, were they also prairie grass?
Yes, my thought, and this is speculation, is that the prairie grass would have been allowed to continue. There'd probably be caretakers of some capacity there, and a couple of weeks before a big ceremony, they'd burn off the prairie, so that by the time people came, it probably wouldn't have looked that much different from what it looks like today, almost a lawn. But that would have refreshed the prairie to keep it a prairie for the purposes of keeping the game population up, and it would have made it, easy to watch the moon rises from those sites. So yes, I think so, but I don't have anything other than sort of what seems like common sense to me to support that. Yes, sir.
I noticed a pond structure in the back, and it
Yeah.
was on the original
Yes.
Squire Davis's map. Is that the pit where maybe the earth came from for the mound building?
That is exactly what I thought when I started my work there, but then later I discovered the James and Charles Salisbury manuscript, which was written in 1862. They were actually present when ditches were being dug to drain it and found peat and marl at the bottom. So it's a kettle lake, and it was probably, that water feature was integral to designing the earthworks around it. I'm sort of reminded of Mesoamerican sites around cenotes and things, and wonder, the part that sort of water played in the architecture and the ceremonies that took place there. Yes.
Have there been is there enough space there surrounding those earthworks to do like geomagnetic testing like Jared Burke did at Hopewell to find where people might have aggregated?
You mean in the surrounding areas, not
There's
just
enough space around there, because if you're having 1,000 or 2,000 people coming, they're going to leave some kind of footprint.
And the short answer is no. I mean, because I showed you that photograph of it's all developed all around it. Jared is, in fact, working at all the sites to do geomagnetic inside the enclosures, hoping he'll find things like he found at Fort Ancient. But unfortunately, the history at these sites is much more cluttered, all the historic buildings in the Great Circle. But that's just another layer of archaeology, and so we're getting better information about where those structures were located. But just on analogy with Fort Ancient, where there's structures all around it, I mean, that's why this painting shows that. By analogy with Fort Ancient, we think the same thing must have been happening here. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a little bit about its relationship to the Chillicothe area, the mounds in the Great Road or something?
Sure. The parallel walls that go off here based on the Squire and Davis map, probably won't be too hard to get back to that. I don't have the Salisbury map, of course, which changed already. Oh, there will be. Try and get one that's uncluttered with other things. There we go. The Squire and Davis map, actually, the notion of the Great Hopewell Road, of parallel walls that went for a long distance, begins with Caleb Atwater in 1820. He suggests that these walls at Newark might go as much as 30 miles and connect this place with another place down on the Hocking River. In spite of the fact Squire and Davis acknowledged Atwater as one of the early contributors to this field, they never mention his claim that those walls might go that far. There's just this cryptic notation here that says parallels 2.5 miles long, and it just shows them sort of squiggling due south, which is not correct. In 1930s aerial photographs, you can clearly see that these, once they cross Main Street, are on a perfectly straight line going off in that direction. But all of us assumed that Atwater must have been so far out that Squire and Davis didn't even want to criticize him, but clearly the walls didn't go 30 miles or 60 miles or anything. James and Charles Salisbury in 1862, so this is 1848, less than 20 years later, they follow those walls 3.5 miles or 2.5 miles and come to Ramp Creek. Cross Ramp Creek, said the walls continued, and they traced them, they said 6.5 miles, and the quote from the unpublished manuscript is, over hills, through tangled swamps, still keeping their undeviating course. And they said they were still going after 6.5 miles, but they weren't that interested anymore. They were going back home. So it's like, tearing my hair out now. But when I read that, I had just come back from the University of New Mexico, where I'd done my undergraduate work, and had been in Chaco Canyon, where these roads go off in great distances. And if the road comes to a cliff, they cut handholds in the cliff or stairs in the cliff to keep the road going straight. And I thought, well, if this is a road like that, it could go a long way. So where would it go if it kept going? And I drew a line across several quad maps, and it goes to the center of Chillicothe. On the Ohio highway map, the dot that represents Chillicothe is where that goes. And of course, Chillicothe is the main center of this. I don't know, and because of all the development in between us, if we'll ever be able to know if that road went 60 miles or not. But even if it only went 6.5 miles, and I think there's compelling evidence from other sources that it might have gone as much as 15 miles. But it's clearly pointing and referencing Chillicothe. It's making a direct physical connection. And that's what I've called the Great Hopewell Road. I speculate that just like some of the roads in Chaco Canyon or in the Mayan area, it could be that same kind of thing. And just to toss out some of this astronomy, the orientation of that, Hively and Horn told me, is exactly at right angles to the sunset on the summer solstice. And Bill Romaine, who's done some archaeology and did some archaeoastronomy, decided to see what it would look like in 100 AD if you were standing in the Hopewell Road and watched the sun set. The sun and the moon are basically in the same places, but the stars have shifted for reasons that are beyond my ability to explain at the moment. But computer programs allow you to wind the sky back. And in 100 AD, if you were standing in the Hopewell Road and the sun set, the Milky Way would be in perfect alignment with the road. So it would look like the road continued up into the sky. Mayan roads, their name for them is Sacbe, which means white road, and that's the same name they give to the Milky Way. The Delaware also refer to the Milky Way as a white road. So, did they build it? Because, I don't know. But we cannot say, well, of course they didn't do that. Ray Hively and Robert Horn told me that in 1982, when they originally rediscovered that the lunar earthworks were incorporated, that they went to a senior Hopewell archaeologist, and he told them that the Hopewell couldn't have done that because they were savages. We've got to get beyond that. Yes, in the back. Yeah, you now, and then
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that some people think that the Newark earthworks are really more complicated than the alignments that are used for the sun at Stonehenge, and then that really it's more sophisticated because it takes a lot more mathematical alignments to get to, because this moon is so complex, all the cycles.
I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but I have no problem saying that Newark's better than Stonehenge. Yes, sir.
I also wanted to mention about the giant skeletons I keep hearing about.
Yes.
That were found in the 19th century. What about those?
I actually get asked about those a lot, and I would simply say that we have almost 8,000 sets of human remains at the Ohio Historical Society, the second largest collection of human remains other than like the Smithsonian right now. And we don't have any giant skeletons. There are people who claim that both the Smithsonian and the Ohio Historical Society has them, but we're hiding them as part of some conspiracy. We've been, let me finish this. If I had a giant skeleton in my collection, we've been losing funding for like the last 20 years. I don't think I've had a raise in more than a decade, more than like a tiny percent. If we had a giant skeleton that I could put on display, we would have people lined up for miles to come into that museum, paying good money for it. Why wouldn't we do that? What some people have told me is that we don't want to undermine Darwin's theory. So it's a bunch of scientists that are conspiring not to show these giant skeletons. But why would giant skeletons undermine Darwin's theory? There are giant elephants and pygmy elephants. If we had giant humans, I don't know, there are lots of accounts, but it seems like, especially in the 1800s, every newspaper account of a mound excavation said they were either giants or pygmies. I think it's very easy to overestimate the stature of a person from a skeleton. When the body decomposes, it kind of relaxes. even physicians at that time period, if they picked up a human femur of a fairly large individual, might not be able to accurately estimate the height of that person, and would think, oh, this was a huge person, look at the size of that femur. But actually the femur would be perfectly compatible with a normal person. What do you want to say now?
Oh, I just wanted to say that you should read some of the accounts, the newspaper articles, and the photographs. And
I've not seen any photographs.
well, look at Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, a new book that just came out. A lot of photographs, a lot of articles from newspapers, from pretty well-respected archaeologists of the time. Just mummies, even.
The newspaper articles don't impress me because I've had reporters write stuff about my work, and it comes out unrecognizable. I mean, the most egregious example of that doesn't relate to a specific finding, but I was at an artifact identification day, and somebody brought artifacts. It was a spectacular cache, and the reporter kept asking me, how much is that worth? And I said, no, you don't understand. This is priceless. We don't put a monetary value on it for lots of reasons. For one thing, we don't want to encourage the buying and selling artifacts, and that would do that. I'm quoted in this newspaper as saying the discovery was unique and worth a lot of money. I didn't say that. But so newspapers at the time would print things on purpose to be sensational, to sell newspapers. So I don't think you can simply take a newspaper account of the discovery of a giant at face value from the 1800s. Photographs, I'd be much more interested in seeing photographs. And there were tall people. Don Dragoo in Mounds of the Dead talks about one of the skeletons from the mound he was excavating as being nearly 7 feet tall. So sure, yeah, there were LeBron James type people, even back then, that were like at the extreme range of variation. But there were no 10-foot tall people or 20-foot tall people. Yes, you had a question.
It's been several years ago, and my memory is not good anymore.
I know how that is.
I hope not. Hope you never get like this. Anyway, we visited a ridge up in, it was a long walk up this big hill in Chillicothe, and it had just been acquired by the state, and we had special permission to visit this ridge. And it had a stone fence all around it that our ancestors had brought their wagons up and taken the stones away to make fences on their farms. I don't remember the name of this place, but I know it was above Chillicothe, and I wondered if you knew about it and if they had decided anything, because they didn't know. They didn't act like they knew anything about it.
It's called Spruce Hill.
Okay.
It's now part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, and it's one of those unusual Hopewell sites that had stone walls. There are a couple other examples of that. The Glenford Works in Perry County also have stone architecture as part of it. And yeah, even though a lot of the stones are gone, there are still some there. It's part of the Park Service site. They're studying it, but it is preserved now. And yeah, that would have been. You can still occasionally get tours to that site through the Park Service.
So why are we so arrogant to think that they wouldn't have a stone road from there to Chillicothe?
Well, it wasn't stone. These walls were made out of earth. And it's not that nobody said they can't. No, but what archaeologists have said is that I haven't proven that they did. And they're absolutely right. But I think the testimony of the Salisbury said it went much further than Squire and Davis went. And in fact, that Squire and Davis didn't cross the river and follow the roads. I mean, people in that same time period studying Chaco Canyon, they weren't paying any attention to the Chaco Canyon roads either. The roads weren't interesting to them back then. They were focused on the big earthworks and the burial mounds. It's only later that research interests broadened to include the surrounding landscape and the roads. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Squire and Davis didn't make much of an effort to follow those. Clearly, they weren't interested even in drawing them accurately. But in 1870, a guy named Samuel Park, based on Atwater's account, decided to look to see if he could follow those roads, and he couldn't. He said the land between Newark and Circleville and Chillicothe was so improved, by which he meant plowed, that he couldn't find any traces, and he doubted that traces could be found. But now we have different techniques. We have remote sensing that perhaps some of those fields could be looked, and maybe traces, the foundations of those walls could still be found. But it looks to me, and Bill Romaine and I think Jared Burks did a LiDAR study of the existing section of walls that's in a woodlot just north of the Licking County Airport. And it looks like all they did to build it was strip the ground and pile the walls up. So the actual surface of the road is below the ground surface. And then plowing would simply restore that earth back down where it was. So there might not be much of a signature. They didn't dig ditches. It's just moving the earth, and then if it just got plowed back.
There's no foundation.
Doesn't appear to be, at least based on that hypothesis. So we may never be able to test it, which means it's not even a testable hypothesis, which means I can't be right or wrong anymore, which is kind of sad and frustrating, because I would like to know whether it went the whole way or not. But even if it didn't go the whole way, if it only went 15 miles, it's an extraordinary set of parallel walls in the Hopewell world, and it's pointing at Chillicothe for a reason, whether or not it went all the way or not.